Hi, folks. Welcome back to my storytelling and introduction videos. This is Dr. Nicholas L. Stefanski, Alfred State College. So this is part 2 of the video series, talking about the essentials of storytelling. We just finished with plot, and we're moving on to characters for part 2. So this one is going to be all about characters. So the first way we can break down studying characters in a story is in terms of the importance of their function in the story. So think about them in terms of function. And they can be roughly divided into 3 types: primary, secondary, and tertiary characters. So your primary characters, also commonly called main characters, these are going to be characters that are absolutely essential to the story in terms of moving the story forward. They appear in most or all of the scenes, and they're really kind of sort of the reason for the story and or the thing that makes the plot go and moves it forward. So example would be from the story The Hobbit. Would unsurprisingly, the primary character in that case is Bilbo Baggins, right? He's obviously the primary character of the story, the focus of the story. And, sometimes the story will be named after the main character, like the Hobbit refers to Bilbo the Hobbit. Your secondary characters are important, serve an important function in the story. But if you think about their role, their purpose in the story as a whole, is really to kind of just help or support the development of the primary. So they'll be important to the story. They'll appear in multiple scenes, but if you evaluate the story as a whole, they're really sort of just there to assist with the development of the main character, the primary character. And if you can see if you can tell from my public domain and Creative Commons non-copyright encroaching art here, that's a picture of Gandalf. So Gandalf in The Hobbit, of course we're talking about The Hobbit, not The Lord of the Rings, right, is kind of a great example of a secondary character. Obviously, he's super important. He appears at all sorts of times to save the day and to give Bilbo advice and to set him on the right path and so on. But if you think about it, his role is really just to kind of support the development and decisions of Bilbo, right? To kind of help him out. And then some of the other important characters in something like The Hobbit, like Thorin, would definitely be a secondary character. Right? Their role is to kind of either give advice or sometimes to cause conflict, to do something which will then allow the primary character to act in a way that further develops their character that we find interesting as viewers. Your tertiary characters generally are only going to appear in one scene or one episode, or, one event, and they serve a very narrow function in the story. So, for instance, in the story of The Hobbit, where early on they encounter the 3 trolls, the trolls serve a function only to sort of set up this dangerous event, this test for which Bilbo then kind of cleverly overcomes by talking, keeping the trolls talking and arguing and telling stories and so on to delay until the sun comes up, right? So really, they're only there. They're not there kind of for their own purpose. When we think about them as tertiary characters, they're really only there to kind of show Bilbo's cleverness and maybe like legitimize him in the eyes of his new companions and so on. So that's primary, secondary, and tertiary characters. Another way to divide up talking about characters is, are they flat characters or round characters? And now often there will be some correspondence between these and primary, secondary, tertiary, but not always. So it's important to keep in mind. So flat characters, we call them flat characters when they're really only defined by one or maybe a few relatively simple and straightforward traits. So, for instance, a lot of times in stories, particularly children's stories, simple stories, especially like the villain, will sort of just be defined by their evilness or their scariness, right? We don't get much interesting characterization about them beyond that. And obviously, I have a um, creative common image here of Snoke from the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And I think Snoke was a very flat character. He's just sort of evil. He runs the First Order. He wants to do evil things. And it's not really clear why or what his backstory is or uh, anything particularly that's interesting about him other than the fact that he's evil. Right? Now, we usually kind of often think that flat characters are just sort of like bad or lazy or poor characters, poorly drawn, poorly written about. And sometimes that's true, um, such as in the case of Snoke, I think. But that may not be always be true. In some cases, a flat character can be used to actually very kind of interesting effect. And an example of that is uh, in the novel Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. All the characters, but in particularly the main character, the protagonist, is just called the Kid. It doesn't even have a name, never gets described. He's just sort of a mystery, right? And you take in all the things that the kid is seeing, but he has like no interiority at all. He doesn't seem to think anything about it, right? And so that in Blood Meridian, that actually I think it serves a very kind of interesting function because you sort of projecting yourself into the kid, and you're thinking, well, the author's not giving us anything about this. Like, what would this guy be thinking? And if you ever read Blood Meridian, which is an extremely, I mean, it's an excellent book, but extremely violent and highly disturbing in a lot of ways book. So you kind of find yourself wondering, like, what kind of person must the kid be to be kind of witnessing all of this, right? Um, and same could be said for some other of characters in Blood Meridian. They're actually their flatness in some ways makes them interesting, but um, it's not necessarily a bad thing, although we often think about it that way, and sometimes it is. And then obviously the opposite of flat characters is round characters, and your round characters are going to be defined by multiple, often contradictory traits, and your round characters are going to be the ones that often are undergoing some kind of moral dilemma or ethical struggle and so on. So we could think about Jaime Lannister in Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire. If you're not familiar with that, I mean, you might think of Anakin from the Star Wars prequel trilogy, in which sometimes we see the character thinking and doing good things. Sometimes they're sort of contradicting themselves and doing evil things. Or it doesn't necessarily have to be good and evil, but in some ways they have kind of competing desires and competing drives, right? And so a lot of people think that this makes round characters feel a lot more realistic, a lot more like real people, right? Because in our real everyday lives, we're not sort of just characterized by certain things. You know, some days we are really hard workers and industrious, and then maybe a couple days out of the week where those are our days to be lazy, right? So we can be all of these things at different times, and sometimes we can be multiple things at once. And so that usually describes round characters, which again are usually thought of uh, as being better written characters in some way, although every story has kind of its uses and needs for flat characters. So it's not necessarily a good, bad type thing. Then you have another way of dividing it up are static characters versus dynamic characters. And again, oftentimes your static characters will also be flat. But again, that's not necessarily true. It's just, well, it's oftentimes true. Static characters mean they're static. They stay the same throughout the course of the story. They don't undergo any development or change. They're kind of regardless of what happened in the story, they're the same character at the end as they were at the beginning. And dynamic characters are obviously the opposite of that. They change and develop over the course of the story. So as an example of a static character here, I have C-3PO, who, as a fun fact, is the only character that's featured in every single one of the 9 Star Wars main saga films. And he is exceedingly static, right? He sort of plays the same kind of goofy, know-it-all, too polite to function in the world of Star Wars, fixation on etiquette, comic relief guy in every, or droid, I guess he is, in every one of those films, right? He doesn't change at all, regardless of all the things that he's seen. And you'd think he would sort of maybe change his ways or sort of react in a different way based on the things that he's undergone. Well, like I said, I guess his memory does get wiped at one point, so that explains some of it. But anyways, definitely a static character. For dynamic characters, as an example, I went here with Sansa Stark from Game of Thrones, and she, as anyone who's watched Game of Thrones knows, undergoes kind of a crazy transformation. I mean, a lot of it's because she sort of gets older and grows up over the course of the saga, but she's kind of how to put it, interested in sort of frivolous things as a young girl early on, and becomes sort of deadly serious by the end, right? So without spoiling it for you at all. So, and you can probably think of other examples of characters that undergo a dramatic change over the course of the story. We can also talk a little bit about characterization, and this is the method by which the author informs us about the characters and lets us know what their traits are. And the 2 basic ways of doing this are direct and indirect. Right? So with direct characterization, this is where the author just tells us straight up what the character's traits are. Right? So it says this guy is evil. He likes ribeye steak, and he runs really fast. Right? We just tell you directly. It's like tell rather than show, is direct characterization. And I have an example from Tolkien's world, in this case, the Silmarillion, describing Sauron and just basically telling us that he's evil. He's an image of malice and hatred made visible. We're just supposed to know that he's evil, right? And, you know, when you think about any of the Tolkien worlds and Lord of the Rings, especially when it comes to Sauron, we don't get much of his point of view or what his motivations are. We just know that we're just told that he's evil and we just accept it. That's direct characterization. Indirect characterization, on the other hand, is when we have to do a little work as a reader because we have to infer the character's traits from their actions, from what we see or hear about them doing. And so this is when you show rather than tell what the character traits are. Direct characterization is tell, indirect characterization is show. And so a good example of this is Jaime Lannister, again, Game of Thrones. And here we're thinking more explicitly about the HBO television show rather than the books, because you don't get very much of his interiority. You just see his actions, and sometimes his actions seem really bad, and sometimes they seem really good. And so then, as the viewer, you need to sort of puzzle out, like, oh, what are this guy's motivations? What's driving him? Right? We don't get much telling of that, but we can sort of think about it and ponder it, and sort of piece it together from the actions that we see. Oftentimes, just like some of the other dichotomies that we've talked about, indirect characterization is thought of as being kind of superior or better than direct characterization. Like showing is more interesting than telling. But again, as like I've told you in all the other cases, there are very good reasons in stories, sometimes for using direct characterization. In that, for one thing, you may not just have the time and the space to devote to having a lot of different episodes that slowly develop a character by indirect characterization. Sometimes you're just going to want to say, like, okay, that guy over there, evil. Um, Now we're going to focus on what I actually want to focus on, which is these other characters. So just make sure you're aware of those two different methods and what they mean. Another kind of interesting way of thinking about characters and characterization is this idea of character archetypes. And if you're not familiar with the word archetype, what an archetype is kind of an example, an exemplar that's sort of so classic and so commonly ingrained in our culture. Oftentimes going back thousands of years, that they're present across many stories. Lots of stories have them, right? And so this kind of theory of character archetypes is actually based on the psychology of Carl Jung, who's a psychoanalyst who's contemporaries with Sigmund Freud, but had sort of his own theories. And it's been adapted and brought into literary studies, primarily through Joseph Campbell, who I mentioned earlier. This idea of the monomyth. I wrote a book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and his idea is of the monomyth is sort of the same story keeps getting told and retold again and again across our culture, and not just across our culture, but even sort of across every culture. That really it's the same story that just keeps changing a little bit in its individual manifestations, right? And so you can, based on Jung and Campbell, you can sort of compile a list of the different types of archetypal characters that people think occur in every story. And here we have on the little chart the hero, the sidekick, the maiden, the wise old man, the nurturing mother, the eternal child, the villain, the shapeshifter, the trickster, right? And you could you can see the examples from these different popular franchises. You can maybe think of your own sort of favorite franchise or epic story, and think about, do you have ones that fit in here, right? And so, sort of the idea of the character archetype approach is these different characters, even though they're very different people, they're essentially kind of the same, and they play sort of the same role, right? So let's look at so we have wise old man, we have Dumbledore, Gandalf, Obi-Wan, and Shepherd Book, right? So the idea is like, all right, so say you've seen all of these, you've seen maybe the first three, you haven't seen Firefly, that you're watching Firefly, you see Shepherd Book and the way he acts and conducts himself, and then something like in your subconscious kind of clicks and says, "Oh, I got it. That's the wise old man." So I can fit him into his place in the story, and I know what he's doing, right? Uh, and that sort of applies to all the different types. Okay, so that brings us to activities and discussion for this part of the module. So I'm going to ask you to go to this website, the archetype page of TV Tropes. tvtropes.org has a listing of their own archetypes like we just talked about. So go ahead and go to that page, and I'll make it available so you can get this link more easily. They have kind of a updated and extended list of archetypes and subtypes that are even longer than the Jung and Campbell ones, right? So it's going to be a big, long list. So go to that page, look down the list of character archetypes listed, find one that we didn't discuss here. I guess the only one we really discussed is the wise old man. But so then go ahead and make a discussion board post, pick one of the archetypes, and then pick an example character that exemplifies that archetype from a fiction that you're aware of. And then do the analysis of the rest of the points that we covered in this section. Are they a flat character? Or are they a round character? Are they dynamic or static? And if it applies, you can tell us, are they primary, probably if they're interesting enough, they'll probably be for you to pick here. They'll probably either be primary or secondary. Probably won't be tertiary. But all the stuff that we talked about in this chapter, um, try to answer those questions, and then and maybe kind of for bonus points, think a little bit about like, uh, well, why are they that way? Why are they written that way? Did the author use indirect or direct characterization? If you can sort of remember that well, right? And think a little bit about the choices made with the character, and just speculate in a few sentences why that might be. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for listening again, and go ahead and do this discussion activity, and then when you're ready, move on to part 3, which will be about setting.